So yes, thank you everybody for joining Warning Letter Wednesday. We're here with Daniel Barreto, Ex-FDA Investigator. My name is Zephaniah Odidika, co-founder of GKS. And today we're going to talk about RRAs and RIEs, navigating FDA's alternative oversight tools. I'm going to give it off to Dan to give us an introduction. Thank you, Dan.
Well, I guess, a simple introduction to myself, as all of you know, or most of you know, I'm a former FDA investigator, and I've also worked with the pharmaceutical industry, between FDA and the industry for over 45 years. Currently, I'm the president and owner of my own consulting company, PharmQ Global Consulting, and I am senior advisor for GKS on the KeyPedia platform, which is an important tool right now for the entire industry. So what we want to do today is to talk about, Seth, I'm not able to move the slides. Can you move it to the next slide, please? So today we want to talk about remote regulatory assessments. And the reason why I wanted to do this with the network that we're working with on a month-to-month basis through these seminars is because I recently had the opportunity to actually do some technical support for a client in Europe who was the subject of a remote regulatory assessment. In this case, the client received a formal request from the FDA with a number of questions about characteristics of the product, the activities associated with it that had to do with technical testing, had to do with production activities, etc. And in this case, the client was supposed to put together a formal response to each and every one of those questions. The client was also expected to provide a certain number of documents to the FDA. And this being the first time my client was subjected to a remote regulatory assessment, I think that for them it's important to accomplish two things. One is to really understand what was the principle associated with the meaning and the relevance of a remote regulatory assessment. And the second thing was, okay, the FDA is making this request. What do we do about it? How do we present to the FDA a response that it's going to have the intended objective that the FDA had? And I think that the client did the right thing in terms of accessing, our services and our support. Because when you think of, regulatory, remote regulatory assessments, the first thing that people tell you is it's not an inspection. So it gives everybody the impression that because of an assessment is not an inspection, maybe this evaluation that the FDA is having, it doesn't have the same weight, it doesn't have the same relevance as an inspection would have. And what I want to say is there's nothing further from the truth. Sorry, so this is not correct. There is a lot of relevance associated with this, and this is why we are going to be discussing this in a few minutes. So it's not an inspection, it's a review. However, what you need to understand, it's really, what is it that the FDA is going to do with the information they actually access from these remote regulatory assessments? So the definition is that is an examination, it's a review of a company, of its records, and it's conducted entirely remotely. So it doesn't really mean or involve an FDA inspector coming to your site, but that still is intended to evaluate compliance of your activities or specific activities to applicable FDA requirements. So the word compliance here is extremely important, because what that means is that this is serious business to the FDA. And so why is it that the FDA is now getting into these regulatory assessments that are remote? And the reason for that is based on a number of factors. One is the volume of work that the FDA has to do. It's immense. The FDA is using a risk-based approach to assessing and monitoring the industry. And also the FDA doesn't always have all the resources that it needs. So it's found an alternative way to figure out where is it that the FDA has to put its own efforts, right? So now the key components associated with the remote regulatory assessment, it involves a review of records. So when the FDA is asking you for records, that means they're going to review them. They're going to read them. They're going to look for strengths and weaknesses associated with those records. So don't believe that because they ask you to fill out a questionnaire, basically, and that they will not take the time or put the effort into reviewing those records. So the accuracy, the precision of those records and sending the right records to the FDA is something that you have to keep in mind. The other component is what the FDA calls the remote interactive evaluation, RIE. And in many cases, or most of the cases, these remote interactive evaluations are voluntary in nature, because the FDA in these cases is looking at activities that for which it has a certain level of interest, but not necessarily the level of intent that they have is as high as what they would have for a remote regulatory assessment. But nonetheless, listen, whether they call it a remote interactive evaluation or a remote regulatory assessment, the FDA is collecting data from you. The FDA is evaluating data from you, and the FDA will make decisions with respect to the data that it evaluates from you. So I think that when it comes to these activities, do not just be extremely complacent or comfortable. It's not an inspection according to the law. And part of that is because for it to be an inspection, an inspector would have to go to your site. They would have to issue a notice of inspection to you. So they would have to follow a formality. So in the law, remote regulatory assessments are not even defined or considered. So what the law says is that for this to be an inspection, it has to be according to the law. So the FDA, in its wisdom, came up with these concept of regulatory assessments that are remote. But when you look at the outcomes from these, they're really not that different in many cases from what you would expect from an inspection. So I think it's important for everybody to understand a remote regulatory assessment is serious business to the FDA. Next slide. So what are some of the common tools that the FDA uses to oversee, to monitor the industry? So you know the inspection, right? So you could have a pre-approval inspection in which case what the FDA is going to do is to look at two things that are important to them. One is any activities associated with the product that it's under pre-approval inspection, and then the systems that support that pre-approval product. So it's more of a targeted inspection, but of course it also looks into your system. So that is an inspection. If you get a warning letter because of an inspection, then more than likely the FDA is going to do a follow-up inspection to that warning letter. And then, of course, by statutory requirement, the FDA is supposed to perform routine inspections, typically every 2 years for the pharmaceutical industry. And this is just again another form of inspecting. Now, to oversee, there's the issuance of the 483, which if you get a 483, that triggers a warning letter potentially. But the first thing that it triggers is a response from you, which is also evidence development for the agency. The warning letter itself, uh, it's also a tool that the FDA uses to keep track of your level of compliance. Complete response letters for cost inspections. Now, there is also another tool that you really don't want to deal with, which is a criminal investigation, because that's not a GMP inspection, but it's really more of an inspection that is intended to look at the integrity of your activities, and you're not going to get a warning letter from this. You're just going to get a different level of enforcement, which is more criminal in nature. And then from now on, the FDA is talking about remote regulatory assessments. So that toolbox from the FDA, it's increasing, and we all need to get, let's say, used to all of this. And as you recall, even about 2 weeks ago, the departing commissioner from the FDA spoke about a concept called one-day inspections, which, by the way, I mean, for most of us, I want to see exactly how these activities are going to take place, because honestly, I just don't see how a company could be inspected within one day, and for an inspector to be able to really do a very serious assessment. So maybe for some companies that are extremely compliant, that this may work. But again, I think what in the end, all of this is about a risk-based approach that the FDA is using. So next slide, please. So key phrases that are important to this. It's again, it's regular remote interactive evaluation, where the agency actually could even also do conference calls, video conferences with you, and then remote records review, where the agency just looks at records and they may or may not require these conferences. But I want to say something about the video conferences, because keep in mind that these video conferences, yes, they are not inspections, but again, they are another form of evidence development for the agency. So you really need to make sure that your subject matter experts are actually prepared, knowledgeable. So when you get an invite from the FDA that they want to do a video conference with you, you really have to make sure that the people who will be speaking with the FDA through this video conference, these are the right people, that they are prepared, that they have the right documents in place. Some people have asked me, should I have a back room prepared for a remote regulatory assessment, especially if one involves the use of video conferences? And my response is absolutely, absolutely. Assume for a moment that a remote regulatory assessment could take the worst turn that you did not expect, and it's something for which you have to be prepared. Which, by the way, KeyPedia is an important source of information for this type of activity. So one of the things that I want to recommend is that if you have not subscribed to KeyPedia, that you consider doing so. 99% of my presentation here was supported by information that I was able to gather from KeyPedia. And it's interesting how KeyPedia provides excellent feedback, instant feedback on how regulatory assessments are performed. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, what do they seek to accomplish, these regulatory assessments? First, it's a compliance assessment. It's on your product or products. It's on your process or processes. And what the FDA also wants to know is, let's say you got a 483 citation and it didn't step up to a warning letter. But let's say it even stepped up to a warning letter. The FDA now wants to know, do I want to do an inspection, a follow-up inspection, or do I want to do an assessment and find out if the company has done the right implementation of CAPAs? So you need to see all of this as an opportunity or as a potential threat. And let me tell you what I mean by this. If you pass your regulatory assessment correctly, there is a high possibility that the FDA will bypass performing an on-site inspection of your facility. So this is a great thing for you to for you to consider, because if it happens this way, you've done your job. So the opposite is also true. If you don't do a good regulatory assessment response, there is a high possibility that the FDA will consider coming to do an inspection. So they're going to be looking at your corrective action from previous inspections, etc. And now the FDA can also make decisions related to applications. So let's say you have a pending approval for a product, and then the FDA, instead of considering another inspection, because let's say they did an inspection last year and everything went well with that inspection, and FDA doesn't want to repeat another inspection within a year, which is something that you have to keep in mind. This is a good thing. Then use this as an opportunity to avoid the need for a pre-approval inspection. So they're going to be looking at some pre-approval work. They're going to identify some unreported adverse events, or incomplete corrective actions. So what I'm proposing to you is that make sure that your corrective action program is complete. It's well under control, because this is an area, this is a low-hanging fruit area where the FDA is going to say, okay, if we were to do, and I'm thinking like a one-day inspection remote, right? So a supervisory investigator may say, do we need to do this inspection? Well, let's call this company and let's collect information about the status of their adverse events, their corrective action program, their investigations. Let's take a look at 5, 6 investigations, and let's see, was the investigation performed correctly? Did they have the right root cause in place? Did they implement the right CAPA? Yeah, exactly. They do exactly what they were supposed to do. Okay, that's a good signal. Let's reschedule that or postpone that inspection by 6 months or whatever. So this is the sort of thing that could happen. The opposite is also going to be true. That because you really missed doing the right thing, now the FDA is going to be compelled to come and do an inspection of your site. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the duration of a remote regulatory assessment usually lasts a week, but it could be shorter or longer. And this is where, if it's shorter, more than likely you're doing the right thing. If it's longer, it means that either the information that you're giving them is incomplete, or the information that you're giving them is giving them now a reason to want to obtain more information. Now, elements that you should watch for. Why me and why now? So there is always a reason why the FDA wants to do a regulatory assessment. And what I want to say is that if you get a remote regulatory assessment from the FDA, an invitation, I want to see that as a good signal. I want to see that as a positive signal. Because what that means is that the FDA is seriously considering that more than likely you're doing something right and they just want to verify. So don't see the regulatory remote regulatory assessment as something bad, unless you're not doing the right thing, and then you already know. But this is something that you need to. Now, the second thing that is important is what's the theme of the remote regulatory assessment. In the case of my client that I was working with, it was with respect to certain activities that had to do with the way that product was protected from uh, a container closure system perspective. So the FDA was interested in understanding is that container closure system well designed? Was it well validated? So when I was working with my client, I said, you really need to make sure that the FDA gets a pretty good understanding that that container closure system it's exactly what the FDA should be comfortable with. So giving the right data, showing the right that you did the right validation, showing that you did the right stability work, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other thing is how many questions am I getting, right? So the number and type of questions are you getting, it's going to give you a good idea as to where is it that the FDA is trying to go with it. And then, of course, uh, think of the type of interaction that the FDA is proposing. If it's only remote records requests versus remote and interviews, for interviews, on conference calls, I would be more concerned about making sure that the subject matter experts are prepared, that I have a front room there that is facilitating the process, that I would deal with that conversation not as a casual conversation. You are dealing with the agency under an official capacity. So you need to make sure that you're covering that. Let's go to by the way, Seth or George, or do we have any questions so far from anybody?
No questions. No questions yet.
No question. Perfect. So let's go to the next slide. So, so how do they, differentiate from inspection? Are they considered inspection? We already said no. But when you look at the elements associated with what happens during a regulatory assessment, I would say, well, yeah, by definition, it's not an inspection, but the steps that are taken by the FDA are basically similar to what they would do during an inspection. And for those of you who are present here and those of you who will be listening on YouTube, my suggestion is that not only you become familiar with the guidance documents that the FDA is putting together for remote regulatory assessment, but please type this uh, uh, document number. It's called SMG 6001.1. It's a staff manual guide from the FDA because it gives you a very specific information about exactly how the entire MMA process and RIE process goes through. And it also talks about how these assessments are classified. So you'll see RNAI, RVAI, ROAI, the R standing for remote. So is it an inspection? No, but the classifications look pretty much similar, except that they added the R. Is the FDA 482 meaning the notice of inspection issue? No, because there's no inspector going into your facility. But it doesn't matter. The FDA continues to gather information from you. Do you have time frames to meet? Absolutely. And this is something that's very important because if you're not able to meet the time frame, you should be able to communicate to the agency and let them know that you need whatever extra time. So keep that in mind. Are you required to accept a remote regulatory assessment or an RIE? The answer is yes for the mandatory, no for the voluntary. However, listen, when the FDA is telling you that it wants to engage in a communication with you, as much as it's been said that something is voluntary when you're dealing with the FDA, if you ask me as a consultant, and I'm sure that if you asked any other consultant, I would say it's really not voluntary because the agency has an interest in talking with you. Number one. And number two, it is in your best interest to speak with the agency, to maintain a dialogue and communication with them. Any are documents requested by the agency? Of course, they are going to be. If is the FDA 483 issued if required? There is no such a thing as an FDA 483 issued. However, they will write a report that looks pretty much similar to a 483, and that document is also going to be a public document, the same that the regulatory assessment report, once it's completed, is going to be. So I'm not going to take you through the whole thing here, but is the agency obliged to make a conclusion? No, but they will. They will because the SMG 6001.1 provides for that type of activity. And my apologies for the answer that has no, the question has no answer. Can the agency make a decision on the status of the product? That should be yes. So my apologies. I left that out. So, so, so what I'm trying to say is what's similar. The outcomes are going to be more or less the same. Let's go to the next slide. So steps that to effectively manage a regulatory assessment. So first is, listen, you need to become aware of the guidance documents. So the FDA provides guidance for regulatory, remote regulatory assessment. There's a Q&A document, and there's the SMG 6001.1. And then, of course, there's KeyPedia, because KeyPedia is able to, in its database, to have all of these documents in place, and it's able to process any questions you may have with respect to a remote regulatory assessment. So the second thing you need to do is to incorporate these key points of the guidance document into existing inspection readiness procedures. Or you may be able to want to create your own RRA specific procedure. But you definitely need to make sure that you incorporate this type of guidance into your internal inspection procedures. Then train your personnel on the RRA process. Let them understand and appreciate what are the differences, what are the similarities, and in the end, what is the goal of an RRA. The next thing is, as soon as you get the RA, it's just read it, understand exactly what they want, put a strategy around how is it that I'm going to respond to this regulatory assessment? What sort of documents? What are the best documents that I can put? Do I actually put more documents that the agency is asking for? If those documents reinforce my position, of course you can do that. But again, be smart about it. Now, make sure your responses and supporting documents address the FDA expectation, right? So make it right the first time. You have one opportunity to let the FDA know exactly that you're providing the right response. So don't think you're going to get second, third chance from the FDA. The second chance you're going to get, it's going to be an inspection from them, and you don't want that, okay? So do not underestimate the potential or consequences of the outcome of the process. So you really try to understand that in the end, you want an outcome that is going to be positive for you. Provide timely responses to the FDA. So don't sit on your butt. Get going, get working, put your inspection readiness team to work. And whenever you have any doubts, seek the support from a consultant. So it may not be an inspection, but it serves the similar goals and objectives. So follow all your inspection management processes. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of RA outcomes that we pulled from the KeyPedia database. For instance, this company, Thai Union, they got a warning letter regarding their tuna processing violations. You might say, well, I'm a drug person. What does this have to do with me? No, what we're trying to show you is the consequences of that could happen from a remote regulatory assessment. So, but Medical in Mexico, they received a warning letter regarding leaks and mishandled complaints. So the FDA is looking at these things, and they're actually issuing warning letters to companies. Next slide. So here are some metrics that we were able to obtain. So look at the total number of RRAs, 683. So the FDA is taking this process seriously. And one thing that we all need to understand is as the FDA gets more and more comfortable with these regulatory assessments, the more they're going to use them, the better they're going to get at it. So that means that also we, the industry, have to get better at it. So this is obviously during COVID, there were more than now, but I expect that the regulatory assessments will increase. Next slide, please. So key findings of these trends, the highest were in July 2022, 131 assessments in 1 month. There is a decreasing trend, but it's because there's no COVID. I do expect that they will increase, and so what we see, it's about 12 assessments per month. I expect that things are going to change in terms of increasing RAs. Go ahead. Not the same or similar, and so here is an example of a number of a warning letter that was issued to the company. So it says during a remote regulatory assessment. So the warning letter makes references. So and they say here, we received your responses, right? And in the company, the FDA is actually reviewing them. So again, what I wanted to show with to you with this is, wait a second, they're not inspection, but the outcome is the same. So this warning letter, we suggest that you go to KeyPedia to read it if you get an opportunity. Go ahead. So what do we do if you get an RRA warning letter? First, I have to say this: shame on you. You had the best opportunity to actually get it right. So if you get a warning letter as a result of an RRA, you really screwed up. I'm sorry to say this, but you were totally in control of this process. So now that you've screwed up, seek support from an external company, and now you need to prepare for an inspection, because you definitely will get it. Implement an inspection readiness plan. Become ready for a follow-up inspection. It's going to happen. And work hard during the inspection to achieve the highest level of performance and credibility. So RRA warning letters are green light for a follow-up inspection. It's unavoidable, so be ready for it. It's going to happen sooner rather than later. Go ahead. Conclusions or recommendations. So, the oversight enforcement approaches used by the FDA may be different. However, they pursue one objective, which is to determine whether or not, you are in compliance. So proactive inspection and preparation, inspection preparation and readiness remains extremely important. A positive record of performance and compliance definitely will keep the FDA away from your site. So the opposite is also true. So look at these regulatory assessments as an opportunity, because this is going to be of help. So self-monitoring, self-regulation has to become your cultural setting mantra. And one thing that you can do, if you are not able to do anything else, embrace the right AI tools, for instance, our KeyPedia tool, to supplement your decision-making process. So that's what I wanted to share with the audience. Any questions so far from Steph?
Thank you, Dan. This was really good. I'm just going to dive into the
Okay,
GKS
great.
side.
Perfect.
So, so KeyPedia. So KeyPedia is our platform's native AI. So essentially, you can ask the KeyPedia almost like a ChatGPT or a Claude, but instead it has components of GKS's documentation. So at GKS, we pull FDA guidances, annexes, IPCs, global regulatory guidances, as well as the guidance that Dan was talking about. And you can put it into KeyPedia, and then you can ask KeyPedia to emulate an FDA investigator or do anything with it. Find gaps in your analysis or just find gaps in general. If we ask KeyPedia to introduce itself, this is what it says. I'm an FDA regulatory assistant. I can help you find information from the FDA databases, including 43s, warning letters, and inspections, and so on. I'm going to piggyback off of what Dan said, and I'm going to do a little deep dive on the medical device warning letter based out of Mexico. So this is what this warning letter would look like inside of the GKS platform. Looks like they got it on January 8th, but there's more to that story than what meets the eye. If you were to actually read the warning letter, as we will later, you will see some violation codes as well. The violation codes that are affected, that the FDA deemed worthy, that this company had broken. And essentially that's what we can do at GKS, whether it's routine inspection, a for-cause inspection, an RRA, or any other interaction with the FDA, KeyPedia can help you. You can look out how every warning letter is structured, from the issuing office to the product type to the related people. You can also see if there's a PAI, a pre-approval inspection, or a for-cause inspection. You can also see if it's a RRA or a recall investigation. Nothing is too small for the KeyPedia platform. Going into the Unimedical warning letter, it seems like it was about 231 days, which is a very long time for a RRA. Like Dan said, the FDA wants to see what you're doing is good, and the fact that you didn't do well on an RRA is telling. So we can see if you were to read the warning letter, it's a very long warning letter first and foremost, but the FDA requests documents for the first time on May 22nd. And then later on, the FDA on July 23rd, the RA was conducted. Records were reviewed. Again, there was no site visit. And then from August to November 2025, the firm responded. Let's just say the firm, not three firm responded. And it's saying like, oh, they're all inadequate. And then on January 8th of 2026, earlier this year, the warning letter was issued. Some key components of this warning letter was There was one death that was found, which is not good. It was a blood glucose dropped to 1.1. The complaint was closed without an investigation. And then also 11 months between the firm becoming aware of the problem and the FDA initiating a class 1 recall. There was about 41,000, there was more than 41,000 complaints closed without an investigation between June 2023 and June 2025. A lot of case numbers were closed without actually an investigation, which is not good. And more than 5,000 leak complaints tied to their hypergelic, if I'm saying that right, and a DKA over about the same window.
Yeah, hyperglycemia.
There we go. Thank you, Dan. It is telling because every one of these data points was visible in public records before the warning letter was written. Mod reports, class 1 recalls, compliance trends. The key thing about this is that KeyPedia connects all these signals so that teams can see the pattern before the FDA does. And that's where I'll leave it off for now.